Here's one way that the PS5 is objectively better than the Xbox. How's it going, everyone, and welcome to PSReady's weekly PlayStation news show, I guess is what I'm calling it. You know how it works. I round up the 5 biggest stories from the world of PlayStation, so in addition to the one I just mentioned, we might know what studio Sony is picking up next. Capcom might be bringing out finally the multiplayer Resident Evil game that they've been MIA on for a year now. Are we finally getting a Bloodborne remake, and this PS5 exclusive is officially dead? We all know the story of back when Sony bought Bungie. Jim Ryan came out and said, yep, we are nowhere near from done buying new studios and publishers here at PlayStation. We will be expanding our roster in the future, and we haven't really seen that pan out in the past couple of months. But some recent events in the gaming industry have basically pointed the target for the next acquisition by Sony directly at Square Enix. We talked about this last week, but basically Square Enix took all of its best Western IP except for Outriders and Life is Strange and sold them to Embracer Group. So stuff like Deus Ex, Tomb Raider, Guardians of the Galaxy, and Marvel's Avengers went along with this deal. And people were kind of shocked because not only are these really big franchises, but it seemed like they completely undervalued all of these studios and their IP by selling them for only $300 million. And then things got even worse when Square Enix started talking about why they sold these properties and studios. They basically said they want to invest in the blockchain and NFTs. Basically, it seemed like now is the time to buy Square Enix. There have been rumors for a while now that Xbox could be trying to buy Square Enix, but then we heard about this law where, like, if you're a Japanese company, you can basically only merge with another Japanese company. You can't be bought by a Western company. So people obviously looked at Sony and Nintendo. And then if you look at the fact that like every upcoming Square Enix game is basically going to be a PlayStation exclusive for an indeterminate amount of time, people are just like, oh yeah, Sony is definitely going to buy Square Enix. Now, if you asked me about this a couple weeks ago, I probably would have said it made me nervous because having something like Deus Ex, Tomb Raider, or even an Avengers game exclusive to PlayStation, it seems just like a little too crazy having that much stuff be exclusive to PlayStation to the point where it doesn't seem like they could even manage all of that all at once. But knowing now that they got rid of all these Western studios over at Square Enix and Sony would be picking up properties that are mostly going to be exclusive to PlayStation going forward in the future anyway, that just makes a whole lot of sense. And knowing that Square Enix is trying to pull a Konami and they're looking into NFTs and the blockchain and all this stuff no one really wants, I think it would honestly be good for these franchises, like specifically Final Fantasy, for Sony to just take them under their wing. Like, we don't even know what's going on with the part 2 of the Final Fantasy VII remake, and that's crazy because part 1 was largely considered to live up to the hype miraculously. I mean, that game was in development hell for a really long time. It was being worked on at a studio that basically had no pedigree or reason to be working on a game of that caliber. There are so many mistakes Square Enix has made in that same vein over the past few years that, like, yeah, I want Sony to get these IP and make sure that they actually come out looking, running, and playing as good as they should, because Final Fantasy is one of the best IPs in gaming. Like, I'm not even a huge Final Fantasy fan, and I see how important it is to gaming. So yeah, I don't want it to turn out like Metal Gear and Silent Hill and Castlevania, where it's just basically used as an IP to farm out gambling machines. Either way, Summer Games Fest is coming up. We're probably going to get some sort of showcase from Sony talking about upcoming games, specifically in the back half of the year, like this Last of Us remake we still haven't heard anything about. So leading up to that, I think it'd be great timing for Sony to announce an acquisition of Square Enix, if it is going to happen. But if you want to hear first if and when it does happen, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and have your notifications set to all. And if you want to pre-order Final Fantasy 16, I have it linked down in the description. Next up, we get to talk about one of my top 3 favorite franchises in gaming, Resident Evil, because Resident Evil Village is a year old, which is crazy. That game from start to finish is just like ingrained in my head. I had such a good time playing through that game, even though it never really felt like a true horror game. Like, it had all the elements, right? I loved the Eastern European setting. I loved fighting werewolves. I loved fighting vampires, but man, I'm an explorer in games. I crawl over every inch of the map, find every upgrade I possibly can. So I was basically like an OP god throughout the entire playthrough of Resident Evil Village. Like, one-shotting werewolves with a sniper rifle felt awesome. It just never really felt as scary as Resident Evil 7. But what made it feel still like a horror game to me was contrasting it against the free multiplayer game that was supposed to come along with it, our Everse. So right from go, this looked like a completely thrown together multiplayer offering from Capcom. I honestly don't know why they do stuff like this. Like, they had the same type of thing happen with Resident Evil 3 Remake, where we got a multiplayer game that was sort of like a Dead by Daylight ripoff, but this was taking it to an entirely different level. Like, they were taking assets from all of the different remakes of Resident Evil, and they put like a cell shaded comic book look over them so that they would all feel like they were pulled from the same game. It just looked like a thrown together multiplayer like team deathmatch type thing. Honestly, it made me a little bit nostalgic for stuff like Operation Raccoon City and Umbrella Corps, because while those games were largely not great, at least they were doing something mildly original with this Resident Evil IP in the world of multiplayer, not this like weird team deathmatch thing. But yeah, people obviously were not excited for RE-verse. Capcom realized, they said, all right, we're gonna delay this, we're gonna work on it, we're gonna bring it out when it's ready, and then they just went ghost on it. Like, we haven't heard anything about RE-verse other than the fact that Capcom is working on it, and they kind of have to deliver it because they promised it as an inclusion with a game that people paid $60 for a year ago. So they can't really cancel it at this point because people already technically bought it. But now that Resident Evil Village is a year old, it looks like Capcom might be finally releasing it, because this game just got rated, ironically, for Stadia over in Europe. And if a game is getting rated, that means it's finished, it's ready to be viewed by the ESRB or PEGI, I think it is, over in Europe, and it got a rating. So probably I would say this will be out in the next month or two, and yeah, we can dig into it and see if it has improved in the entire year of development that it had. But honestly guys, it's gonna take a lot to impress me with this one. That gameplay they showed off a year ago was not great, and honestly, I would say it's bad. Speaking of horror games that I really love on PlayStation, there are even more rumors afoot about a potential Bloodborne remake, remaster, or maybe even a sequel to the game. Now, this is a game that at the very least needs an update for the PlayStation 5. It did not run great on the PS4 when it came out. It basically got 0 patches after the DLC. It has horrible frame pacing issues. It doesn't look good at 30 frames per second. The resolution is all over the place. Like, people have been begging for some sort of patch, at the very least for Bloodborne, for a long time now, and Sony has just stayed silent on it. But it looks like the reason they've been so silent on it and haven't really touched the game in a long time is because they're working on something new within that universe. So I'm really excited. I get to shout out my friend Dustin over at Sacred Symbols and Last Stand Media. They just did a live show for their 200th episode of the podcast, and during that live show, the host, Colin Moriarty, talked about how we haven't seen the last of Bloodborne. And this guy, I've listened to him, his podcasts, for a long time now, since I was in high school, which is crazy. When he leaks something, it's because he's pretty sure it's going to happen, and most of the stuff he's talked about on Sacred Symbols in an early fashion has come true. Like, one thing in my recent memory is that The Quarry, that upcoming horror game from Supermassive, that was originally a Stadia game that turned out to be bought by 2K when Google started shutting down all the Stadia stuff, and he talked about it well in advance of that being announced, and then everything he said ended up being true. So yeah, I put some trust into this guy, and if he's saying that we're going to see more Bloodborne in the near future, I think it's worth believing. Whether this is going to be a remake, a sequel, or a remaster, or a patch, I don't know. I'm really crossing my fingers that it's a full-on remake by the people over at Bluepoint. I know there's some rumors that they're working on something like Metal Gear Solid or a different classic PlayStation game, but after playing their incredible remake of Demon Souls, all I want from them is a remake of Bloodborne. Look, I love Elden Ring. I am one of the biggest Souls fans out there. I've put a ton of hours into Elden Ring recently. As good as it is, as much as it's like a grown-up version of Breath of the Wild, Bloodborne is still my favorite Souls game, and it just hasn't gotten the respect from Sony it deserves over the years. And at the very least, if they're not fully remaking it, I hope they just give us a patch that fixes the frame rate and the resolution. I mean, the game still, in terms of like style, looks really good. So with just some simple cleanup, I think it could be incredible on the PlayStation 5. Going back to why I think PlayStation should pick up Square Enix, we have to talk about the game Babylon's Fall. So this was a game that had been in the works forever. It was a partnership between Platinum Games and Square Enix. It did come out, but Square Enix just decided to throw it out there, not only at the same time as Elden Ring, but also at the same time as another Souls-like they were working on, Stranger of Paradise Final Fantasy Origins. So yeah, they released a Souls-like game against the biggest mainline Souls game of all time, and then followed it up with another Souls-like game just a few weeks later. Do you see why Square Enix is really losing the thread here, in my opinion? So yeah, this game came out, it was a huge mess, and people were just sitting there like, Like, there's no way anyone's buying this game. And thankfully, it also came out on Steam on PC. And the cool thing about Steam is that you can just see publicly how many people are actively playing a game online, because Steam is an online service. So people have been slowly watching the amount of players playing Babylon's Fall inching down and down and down until last weekend, when there was just one person playing Babylon's Fall online. Like, one single person was connected to the internet playing this game. It's crazy that Square Enix has been sitting there for years with great games like Deus Ex Human Revolution and Mankind Divided selling well, the Tomb Raider trilogy, the reboot trilogy selling really well, Guardians of the Galaxy getting great reviews and also selling pretty well, and then they come back and say that's a disappointment, but then something like Babylon's Fall comes out, doesn't sell nearly as many copies as it needs to recoup its development costs, and Square Enix sits there like, yeah, we're still gonna follow through with the season pass we released for this game. Like, their priorities are so out of whack. It seems like they're just begging for someone to come in and take over these classic IP. Hopefully it's Sony. And then finally, we've got more positive PlayStation news because we get to talk about DRM, the thing that's been plaguing Xbox since the Xbox One was announced. So over the weekend, there's really no way to talk about this exactly because it affected everyone differently. But the long story short is a lot of people who have Xbox consoles could not play their games, whether they were digital, physical, or otherwise. The one issue that seemed to affect everyone is that an online game just straight up would not work. So my friend Ray over at PSReady, he just bought an awesome game called Chivalry 2. It's basically like a first-person knight simulator. It's super gory. I used to play the first one on PC all the time, and the second one is just so much better. So of course he was able to spend his money on the game. He was able to download it to his console, but because of this error with the Microsoft servers, he wasn't able to start the game up or play it, which in my opinion, that's just absolute that they were still selling games that people couldn't even play. And then some people were reporting that single player games that are like on a disc or don't even need to connect to the internet and have no online portion whatsoever, those wouldn't launch either because they hadn't checked in with Xbox's servers in a while. It was a complete mess. And the time frame of this was narrowed down to basically around 36 hours, which is completely unacceptable. I know it's kind of hard to sit here and blast Microsoft for having stuff be offline for 3 days when Sony had their PSN go down for basically an entire summer, but we're in the year 2022 and Sony, coming out of that whole fiasco, basically fixed the problem that Xbox is having. So if you have a PlayStation console and you have a game, I'm just going to use as an example Dishonored 2, most of that game is on the disc, and if your PS5 has ever connected to the PlayStation Network with your account and you've patched the game before, if the PlayStation Network goes offline tomorrow, you'll still be able to take your disc for Dishonored 2, put it in your PS5, and you'll be able to play the patched version of the game indefinitely, unless your PS5 just turns off, which would suck. But even cooler is the fact that this works for digital games as well. So if you went on the PlayStation Store and bought a copy of Dishonored 2 with your PlayStation account, and you had your PlayStation Network account linked to your PS5, and the game was downloaded and patched, if the PSN went down tomorrow, that game would still work just fine. And that's awesome. I feel like Sony deserves a lot of praise for that because of what we're seeing happen on Microsoft's side. Because a lot of the same games don't work like that on the Xbox side of the fence. Like, I'm just gonna go with Dishonored 2. I don't even know if it works for the first example. It's just a single player game with no online. But in this example, if you had the game patched already on your Xbox and you had your account linked to the Xbox Live network and you put the disc in your Xbox, if you hadn't connected to the internet recently, the disc would not work. But of course, it's not perfect on the PlayStation side of the fence either, because publishers really want games to have to connect to the internet regardless of whether or not they have multiplayer. A great example, Diablo 2 Resurrected. If you do not connect to the internet every 30 days with that game, it will cease to work, despite the fact that it has a single player mode. Look, as someone who plays just as many games on PC as I do on PS5, I am not adverse to having all of my games be digital because I've been using Steam since I was in high school, and thankfully I don't really have to worry too much about that going down because Valve has said multiple times if Steam turns off tomorrow, they'll just make it so the DRM just completely goes away and any games you bought on Steam will just be playable. And of course, there's other options on PC like GOG Galaxy, which even lets you link your Steam library to that app, and then it gives you a DRM-free version of the game as long as it's on GOG's store. I think it's cool that PlayStation is pretty close to Steam with their digital games. Like, if you connected to the internet at least once with your PlayStation Network account on that console will be able to play whatever games you've downloaded to it on that account. That's great. It's just insane to me that after Microsoft went through that PR storm with the Xbox One and Don Matrick, where Sony made that video with Adam Boyes and Shuhei Yoshida, where they basically said how to share games on the PlayStation 4 and just handed the disc to each other, they didn't fix this on the Xbox side of the fence. Like, there should be nothing in terms of having to connect to the internet to play single player games on your Xbox. But yeah, that's the problem with the all digital future. You don't own anything, you just own a license to play a game. And that's why people get so up in arms when people talk about streaming being the future of gaming. It just really isn't a good solution.